I am so excited because I have another lawyer. This is a great thing. Jotham Stein, he's not only an owner of his own law firm, Jotham Stein, but also an incredible author. I just finished his book and a speaker, nonetheless. Most lawyers are speakers. Jotham, welcome to the Playbook.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
I'm going to start off right with the book because this was a lesson I've never learned. Was even CEOs get fired. I was a young CEO. I was CEO of the world's first smartphone for Samsung. I was barely 30 years old, and I thought I was untouchable. I lied to people for years and told them I semi-retired before I met Lee Steinberg and ran that organization. But they kicked my butt out of there, and there was nobody around teaching me the lessons that you have in this great book, Even CEOs Get Fired. What was for you the stimulus, as a lawyer, why did you want to write this type of book?
Well, a number of years ago, I wrote the technical book to teach lawyers how to represent entrepreneurs and executives. But I always wanted to write a book for the everyday person, whether they're the CEO or whether they're a new entry out of business school or just out of undergrad or just in the middle of their career, to help them and to open up their eyes, to help them protect themselves in the employment relationship, like you would have needed, quite honestly, and should have had you known when you started out. So that in Even CEOs Get Fired, I discussed what I call the professional prenuptial agreement, which is nothing more than an employment agreement that's negotiated the severance on day one. And the goal that I have with my clients, as I would have with you years ago, would say, how do you maximize your return, David? And that could be money, it could be equity, it could have been protecting your reputation on the back end, it could be not burning bridges, it could be healthcare. But whatever it is, you need to focus on that, and then have it, if you have leverage, put it into that employment agreement. And so that on the back end, you can have a smooth back end, and you can do what you've done so successfully, which is a professional reincarnation, which I also write about in the book. And there are so many clients I have, like yourself. I don't know if you did, because I never asked you this question, but many of my clients, if they protected themselves and done the right things, they call back 6 months later after a termination, after they get kicked out, and they call me and they say, well, getting fired is the best thing that ever happened to me.
Yeah, no, I wish, and it was Andy Cohen who said about you, right? Jotham is the guy you want in your corner, which is what they used to say about me at Lee Steinberg. And what you do, it's so funny because we were just talking about Jim Harbaugh and representing coaches, which to me was an obvious transformation from sports agency of athletes to coaches, because the coaches started making real money. But it's funny because Lee never thought about CEOs, and all the things that you listed out on why CEOs need to read your book, why CEOs need to have you represent them, is the exact same reason why a 21 or 22-year-old or 23-year-old kid needs Lee Steinberg or a sports agent, because there's so many complexities of the future. And that's what you're really not only protecting against and for, but also there's opportunities that you can take advantage of from the situational knowledge and the education that you have. Where do you see similarities with executives and sports and entertainment agents? Because you're absolutely written an agentry book, and you act as an agent in some respects when you're getting, or a divorce lawyer, a family lawyer. But I see more similarities, believe it or not, to agentry than I do to family law.
So, actually, that's pretty interesting you'd ask that, because I was thinking about that before the interview here, because I know you're a sports guy, and really every person who was in sports that needed an agent should read my book, Even CEOs Get Fired, because while they're in sports, the ideas and the concepts are still the same: protecting yourself, maximizing your return, professional reincarnation. So in my view, the way I was thinking about it is, the tools are exactly the same, right? We have knowledge, you have knowledge in the sports world when you represent a sports personality. I have knowledge in the entrepreneur and executive world. But what we're doing is exactly the same thing. We want to find out and maximize the return for our clients, right? The big difference, and you call it a contract, we call it an employment agreement. same thing, right? They're protecting you, in your case, money, bonuses. You know, if you do a good job and you win the Heisman, well, not if you win the Heisman, that's college, but if you win the Super Bowl, you get a bonus and so forth. The two differences that I see really are one, I am brutally honest when I give advice, so I don't pander to the 21 or 22-year-old. When CEOs come in, I tell them what I think, and I have to recalibrate them a lot of times. Now, I assume you and Lee Steinberg have to recalibrate, but you do it in a much nicer way. The other thing that I think is really interesting that you guys have never come up with in the sports world is equity. So imagine you place a coach at a team that stinks. Let's say in my heart, even though I live in California and I go to San Francisco 49er games, I grew up on Long Island and I'm a New York Jets fan. And they haven't been to the Super Bowl in more than 50 years. Imagine you represented a coach there, or you represented a star player and you wanted to get some equity in the New York Jets. Imagine you could do a deal like that. So that's sort of the differences. One is you are all performance based in the sports world, I think, whereas in the business world, there's a lot often equity play. So you start to own the corporation. And the other way is the way you sort of deal with your clients. So if I had a very shrewd, if I understood your world, it would take me a little bit to understand what concepts what you have to negotiate for in the sports world. But I'm sure I could sit down with you, and ask the right questions, and after an hour, you'd be able to give me most of it. But if you actually had a sports personality that had an ego that allowed him to talk to a lawyer who would say, no, I don't agree with you, this is what you should do, then I'd probably be a good sports agent or a good agent in LA, because it's the same thing you're doing. You're protecting somebody's interest and trying to maximize it for them. And you call it a contract. In LA, they call it a contract. In the business world, they call it an employment agreement. But as you know, agreement is a contract, right?
Yeah, which, you have so many different people testimonials from my friends like Michael Archer, who says you're the best. Bonnie Crater, once again, always says you can learn from the best, which is the situational knowledge that we have in the book. What's rare about your book is that you're very straightforward and pragmatic in the teaching. So I think if you're an executive that you're in the world, Stephen Hertz wrote that book, Don't Take Yes for an Answer. I think this book complements that book because you give the raw truth to an executive that they may be romanticizing their careers and putting themselves and their families at jeopardy because they think their egos at least allow them to believe in safety, security, and the prospect of the future that may not actually exist. Now, you advise entrepreneurs, but you're also an entrepreneur. And you left a big firm when you were a young lawyer to start your own company. So you learned about what Bonnie is suggesting, right? Learn from the best. What are the biggest lessons that you learned that you now utilize with your legal education and experience to protect and promote entrepreneurs, especially executives?
I sort of talked about it originally. What I learned when I went out on my own is, first of all, to be proud about having your own business and trying to build your own business, which is why I did it. And I didn't want to follow what other people had to say. I knew that I could be entrepreneurial, and I built my business in the same way many of my clients have. But I also, in that first year, I almost went under because I was undercapitalized. So I understand what my clients go through when they try to raise money, those that are in the entrepreneurial world. But what I've learned is what you need to do over these 20 odd years from people, that you talked about. I teach people like Mike Archer, very successful business person, Andy Cohen, former CEO of Caring.com. I teach them how to protect themselves, and that Bonnie actually says that in her endorsement of me. How to have a really strong employment agreement to protect your downside and to maximize your return. So that, again, I talked about in the beginning, when you get terminated, when things don't work out, that you can have a professional reincarnation and run the next company. And so, but this book is not just for the C-suite execs, it's for everybody, really. One of the biggest endorsements that I'm really proud about or is somebody who read my book, after reading my book, sent me an email. And so the endorsement, like, and the nice commentary is not in the book. It's actually on the website, which, as you probably figured out, is evenceosgetfired.com. And it's from somebody who said he's in his 70s. He wrote in and he said, you know, I'm a retired guy. This book really is for everybody. It's not just for C-suite people. I had a very successful career. I never reached the C-suite, essentially, is what he said. And he said, all along the way, I thought I was getting a great deal. And I wish you had written this book 40 years ago, because now I realize I left so much on the table. And that's like one of my proudest endorsements. Like I said, it's only on the website, but it really shows that when you're starting out, you know, whoever you are in your middle of your career, you can really benefit from reading this book.
One of the things that I benefited, and I've written books and been noted for negotiations, is I love the do's and don'ts that you have in there in a variety of different aspects of being an entrepreneur, being an executive, being an employee in general, that I wish, and I'm 53 years old, and as someone who's run the most notable sports agency in the world, that I had read the book before, because I could have made not only millions of dollars myself, but allowed my clients to make millions as well. What are some of the do's and don'ts in the book that you talk about in compensation? Because I think, you know, those do's and don'ts about compensation are applicable to almost everyone.
Okay, so at compensation, the dues are, make sure it's written down in a contract. If you're a commission guy, you want to have it in a contract, just like you in the sports world want to say, you know, you trigger your bonus if you do X, Y, and Z in the AFC Championship, for example. You need to have that. You have to know what your own goals are, what it is you want, because some people want equity, some people want salary. In the sales world, they want commissions. So it's really understanding what your goals are, so you can maximize your return. And then, in my view, it should be in a strong contract that's very clear. And so what you're doing is often in a contract, it's not just protecting what you're making in the moment, but you're protecting down the road if you get terminated in a situation where you've left or potentially left a lot on the table. And that happens all the time, by the way. And the nicest, the shrewdest, the most experienced, the guys that get A+ or the women that get A+ their entire life and everything they do get fired for all sorts of reasons, for economically rational reasons and economically irrational reasons. And what I mean by economically irrational, sometimes somebody wants to steal back their equity, or they don't want to pay them something for an emotional reason, that then if the stockholders of the company could vote, they'd actually vote to keep that executive or keep that employee. But they don't, the stockholders don't vote on employment matters, essentially. And so you're at the whim often of someone who is just emotional and has different concerns and might actually be interested in protecting their own hide rather than in building the business.
Yeah, and I think the nuance in relationships and leverage are indicated in the book very clearly. One of the other things that I love is the foresight about change. You know, well, there was one NBA agent, I won't give him too much notoriety, but he actually had a pandemic clause for his NBA players, which I thought was genius. You know, was already prepared and had the foresight for a pandemic. You actually have some strategies that I think are applicable for post-COVID, that there's going to be some changes that we should be prepared for. So I thought maybe you could help us understand what we should be looking for after COVID. You know, and these are the types of inputs that we get that even CEOs can get fired.
There's going to be so much uncertainty in the post-COVID world. So and you never know if you're running a company or in a company, or you're going to get, or even if you're a lower level employee, when you're going to get asked to leave, or when alternatively you may love working at home and you're required to come to work and you're still worried about issues about commuting and who knows, all these other viruses that are coming out in these strains. So you can, the best thing you can do is protect your downside so that you can have a smooth transition. And the way you do that is entering into a strong employment agreement. If you have leverage, there are a lot of things you want to do. You want to protect your equity. You want to protect your compensation. You want to make sure that if you have stock options, you have a post-termination exercise period. But even for the lower level employees, just like the line engineer, if they want you and you have a little bit of leverage, even a one-line sentence, as I talk about in the book, or a two-line sentence can really protect you, and so that and your family so that when things go wrong, and they often go wrong, even if you think on day one they're not going to go wrong, they often do. You can come out on the better end.
Oh, absolutely. And then one of the other areas that are of interest to me is that you're a target when you're a CEO. You're a target when you're a leader. There's so many different things as the political, economic, socioeconomic trends and motivations move. How do you protect and prepare for certain discrimination fears that we may have as leaders, or some other sort of trend or movement that you can be susceptible for actions and activities a decade previous, 2 decades previous, that could put you at jeopardy, that even CEOs get fired for things that they do 10, 20 years ago?
Okay, well, that's a very interesting question. It's the basic. The first thing you have to do is be political with a small p, to understand the way trends are moving, right? You need to understand who the people are and what's out there, and what your potential liabilities can be. So in terms of, a movement, and you know what your history has been. All right, so that's outside of the contracting. What you can do, though, is to protect yourself. If somebody comes to terminate you for any reason, it's the same. I don't want to sort of keep repeating myself, but it's the same thing. If you have a strong contract that says, if you terminate me for any reason or no reason at all, unless I embezzled or something, that I get, for example, a year's worth of severance, and I get a year or 2 years acceleration of my stock options or restricted stock, or I get a year of healthcare paid by you, or I get a nice exit letter. See, all that a professional prenuptial agreement is, an employment agreement, is really a severance agreement negotiated on day one. And so if you are, to protect yourself against those trends that you might not even be able to see in your mind now, because we don't know where the world is moving, post-COVID world, have no idea. You never know who's going to be running the country, or the splits, or what's going to happen. What you can do, though, is protect yourself and your essentially compensation and your equity and whatever else it is that's important to you, by having a strong contract that basically says, if you come to get rid of me, you maybe I'm the person being gotten rid of. I can say, well, I think this is a really dumb thing you're doing, or I think you're relying on something that happened 10 or 20 years ago. I mean, we all did things 10 or 20 years ago that we might regret, but you know what? I think what you're doing is dumb. But you can stick out your hand and you can say, God bless you, pay me and vest me and give me what's in my contract.
I love that. Last question real quick. The book is titled Even CEOs Get Fired, but I find it's really for entrepreneurs and startup executives, even middle management people that are aspiring to be CEO. I think the value goes far beyond, you don't have to be a C-level executive to take away a lot of things from the book. Because the title is, Even CEOs Get Fired, obviously CEOs, it's a must read for CEOs. Why is this a must read for startup entrepreneurs?
For startup entrepreneurs, it's a huge must read. I don't want to self-aggrandize.
I agree. That's why I want you to tell them why.
Okay, because if you're going into the startup world and you're starting up a company, there's two things you really have to know more than anything. One is you have to understand what liquidation preferences are, because you can have a company and you can have millions and millions of shares. You can even control the company in the voting, but some investor may have liquidation preferences that can mean when you sell your company, you get zero. That's something you really need to understand. And my book, Even CEOs Get Fired, talks about that at length. And there's 59 stories in the book that are completely fictional stories. I wrote them at a Pete's Coffee, but they're repetitive events that happen all the time. And one of those repetitive events is the shrewd entrepreneur who's invented something but doesn't understand what liquidation preferences are. A second thing that you have to understand is what, as an entrepreneur, and I see this mistake made all the time, is what is the capitalization table? So people call me up, I'm being offered 1 million shares to go work for David Meltzer Enterprises, 1 million shares. And I say to them, so what? What does that mean? So a million shares in David Meltzer Enterprises, or David Meltzer's 1 million shares at Lee Steinberg's Enterprises, if there's 2 million shares outstanding, means a lot. That's 50%. If there's 100 million shares in David Meltzer's enterprise or in Lee Steinberg's enterprise, it doesn't mean so much. So that's why there's a lot of other stories, these 59 stories. are many of them are about entrepreneurs and executives, newbies that are starting out, even though they may know how to make the best biopharma or the best Wi-Fi or the best security, whatever their genius is. By reading my book, they'll understand how to maximize their returns and think about that. It'll cause them to think about that. They'll understand how to protect themselves, protect their equity, protect their compensation, protect other things that are important to them. And they'll understand that if things go bad, if they've set themselves up and given away some of their company, because I do talk about that, and things go wrong, how they can have a professional reincarnation and start their next company. Because there are a lot of entrepreneurs that fail once, they fail twice, and then they hit the big one on the third time or fourth time.
Well, I'm going to give you another testimonial that you can use as well, because even CEOs get fired, to me, is let Jotham Stein pay your dummy tax. You don't have to pay it. He'll pay it for you. Read this book. It's a must read for every business person, entrepreneur, executive out there.